They laughed. The German generals actually laughed. To them, the Americans were amateurs, soldiers who lived in luxury, whose tanks drank gasoline faster than they advanced, and whose logistics, they claimed, would collapse the moment they entered Europe. But in the summer of 1944, that laughter died. Because when General George S. Patton's tanks roared across France in one of the fastest armored advances in military history, it wasn't just firepower that made it possible. It was a miracle of logistics, a 24-hour lifeline of trucks, grit, and determination known as the Red Ball Express. And it would prove that America's real weapon wasn't just the M4 Sherman or the Mustang fighter. It was the power to move mountains, 1 gallon of fuel at a time. This is the untold story of how an army of drivers, many of them young, untrained, and overlooked, kept Patton's Blitz alive and shocked the German high command into realizing that the Americans weren't just coming. They were unstoppable. The beaches of Normandy had been won. After months of brutal fighting, the Allies had finally broken through the hedgerows of France. Operation Cobra had shattered German defenses, and General Patton's newly activated Third Army was unleashed like a thunderbolt. In just days, Patton's armored divisions stormed through Brittany, smashed the German 7th Army, and began racing toward the Seine. It was blitzkrieg, American style. But behind that glory lay a terrifying reality. Patton's tanks were outrunning their supplies. Every Sherman tank required nearly 400 gallons of fuel to travel 100 miles. Every truck, every jeep, every artillery piece needed ammunition, spare parts, and food. And the farther Patton advanced, the longer his supply lines stretched back to Normandy. The problem wasn't courage or speed, it was gasoline. By mid-August, Patton's army was burning through 350,000 gallons of fuel per day. His tanks were unstoppable until they ran dry. In one letter, Patton wrote, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." The Allied planners had never imagined their armies would move this fast. They'd expected the Germans to fight for every inch of ground, not to collapse and retreat. The result? The front lines were now 500 miles ahead of where the main supply depots still sat, on the beaches of Normandy. Trains were destroyed, bridges were blown, and France's rail system was in ruins after years of occupation. The roads were cratered, narrow, and jammed with retreating Germans and advancing Allies. The logistics officers faced an impossible task: how to feed, fuel, and arm millions of men, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and thousands of tanks deep inside enemy territory. German intelligence mocked the situation. One report to Berlin sneered, "The Americans will choke on their own abundance." Even Hitler laughed when told that Patton was advancing faster than his fuel could follow. "Let them run out of gasoline," he said. "Then we'll crush them." But Hitler was about to learn a painful lesson. Never underestimate American improvisation. On August 25, 1944, U.S. logistics officers gathered in a tent near Cherbourg. They had a simple yet radical idea. If trains couldn't move the supplies, trucks would. They drew a red circle on a map, the designated priority route from Normandy to the front, and marked it Red Bull, an old railroad term for fast freight. Every vehicle using the route would have priority over all others. There would be no stops, no detours, and no excuses. Within days, the Red Ball Express was born. Thousands of trucks, mostly the sturdy GMC CCKW2 1.2-ton deuce and a half, were pulled from depots, loaded with gas cans, food, and ammo, and sent rumbling east toward the front lines. They rolled day and night, headlights covered, through rain and mud, dodging potholes and wreckage. There were no rest stops, no sleep, and often no maps. Just a painted red ball on signs, pointing the way forward. The route stretched over 700 miles, looping from Normandy to Patton's spearhead near the Seine, and back again. At its peak, more than 6,000 trucks thundered down that highway every single day. It was the most ambitious supply operation in modern history, built in less than a week. But here is what most people don't know. Nearly 75% of Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. In an era of segregation, these men were often given support roles, not combat duty. Yet, when the call came for drivers, they volunteered in droves. They drove through enemy fire, mechanical failures, and exhaustion, often armed with nothing but a .45 pistol. They called themselves the real front line, because without them, the tanks and guns at the front wouldn't fire a single shot. Private Luther Smith, one of the drivers, later said, "We didn't fight with bullets, we fought with wheels." They slept in their trucks, ate cold rations, and ran convoys that lasted up to 60 hours non-stop. The roads were so dangerous that soldiers joked, "If the Germans don't get you, the curves will." But nothing stopped them. They kept the gas and ammo flowing, at one point delivering over 12,000 tons of supplies per day. Even Patton himself knew who was keeping his tanks alive. When he visited a convoy site, he saluted the drivers and shouted, "Without you men, we'd be stuck in Normandy." When German intelligence finally grasped what was happening, they couldn't believe it. Their reports noted an unending stream of American trucks crossing France like a steel river. To the Wehrmacht, it was inconceivable. Germany's own supply system had collapsed under Allied bombing. They had relied on railroads and horses. The Americans, in contrast, had built a rolling empire of logistics that stretched across an entire continent. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, would later admit, the Allies' ability to maintain their advance, that was their true miracle. We had no answer for that. As Patton's tanks roared toward the German border, fueled by the relentless grind of the Red Ball Express, even Hitler's top generals began to realize the truth. They weren't just fighting an army. They were fighting an industrial civilization on wheels, and soon that realization would change everything. As the dust of D-Day settled in the summer of 1944, the Allies were advancing through France faster than anyone had anticipated. The German army was in disarray, retreating eastward as its defensive lines crumbled under the relentless pressure of General Patton's Third Army and the British forces under Montgomery. But while the Allied armies seemed unstoppable on paper, an invisible threat was brewing behind their lines, one that could have halted the entire liberation of Western Europe. Fuel, ammunition, food, tires, spare parts, the lifeblood of war. In the early days of August 1944, Patton's armored divisions were devouring gasoline faster than the supply lines could handle. For every mile his Sherman tanks rolled forward, thousands of gallons of fuel were burned. And yet, the port of Cherbourg, the main entry point for Allied supplies, was still badly damaged from German sabotage. The logistics nightmare was beginning to show. German generals, observing from their retreating headquarters, scoffed at what they believed was an inevitable collapse of American overreach. To them, it was simple. The Americans might have overwhelming numbers, but they lacked the experience and discipline of German logistics. One German officer famously remarked, "The Americans are amateurs of tactics and artists of supply. But even artists can starve when the paint runs out." But behind the lines, American engineers, logisticians, and truck drivers were working around the clock to ensure that never happened. The Allies had learned from the chaos of the Normandy beachhead. And now, in one of the most daring and improvisational feats of World War II, they would build a lifeline unlike anything seen before, a roaring artery of steel and wheels that would keep Patton's engines alive. It began with a meeting in early August at the headquarters of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. Reports poured in showing how supply convoys were bogged down on narrow French roads, often choked with mud, debris, and wreckage. Trucks took days to deliver a single load, and the frontline divisions were operating dangerously low on essentials. Patton's tanks had even been forced to halt temporarily, not because of enemy fire, but because there was simply no fuel left to move forward. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the gravity of the situation. The success of the entire Allied campaign depended not only on soldiers and tanks, but on the invisible army of truck drivers and supply officers who could deliver goods across hundreds of miles. Something radical was needed. Enter the Red Ball Express, a name that would soon become legendary. The concept was simple, but daring. Create a non-stop convoy system dedicated solely to delivering supplies from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. The Red Ball term was borrowed from U.S. railroads, where Red Ball meant priority freight, cargo that moved without delay. For this operation, it would mean one thing: speed. Bright red circles marked the route signs, signaling that any truck bearing the red ball insignia had the right of way, no matter what. French civilians were ordered to stay off the road, and even military traffic had to yield to these convoys. The plan called for thousands of trucks, 2 1.2-ton GMC Deuce and a halves, Dodge weapons carriers, and jeeps, to move in an endless loop between the supply depots near Cherbourg and the forward depots closer to Patton ES tanks. In just 3 days, American engineers mapped out a 700-mile round-trip system with one-way routes for loaded and empty trucks. Supply points were organized with assembly line precision, refueling stations, maintenance yards, and rest camps for the exhausted drivers. It was a logistical masterpiece born out of desperation. But there was one more critical factor that made the Red Ball Express possible: the men behind the wheel. The majority of these truck drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units, who had been assigned to logistical roles rather than combat. They were part of the Transportation Corps, often overlooked and underappreciated. Yet now, they were handed the responsibility of keeping the Allied advance alive. One such driver, Private Joe W. Wilson of the 818th Truck Company, recalled years later, "We didn't have the luxury of slowing down. We drove day and night, sometimes under fire, sometimes with no headlights. If you stopped, you got run over. If you got lost, you found your way back, or you never made it at all." Convoys began rolling out on August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated. At its height, the Red Ball Express would see over 6,000 trucks on the move daily, hauling 12,000 tons of supplies every 24 hours. They moved fuel in 5-gallon jerry cans stacked to the sky, crates of ammunition, rations, medical equipment, and spare parts. To German eyes, it looked impossible. To American commanders, it looked like salvation. But behind the glory, the strain was immense. The roads were narrow, winding, and often unpaved. Rain turned dirt into sticky mud that swallowed tires. Drivers slept in their cabs or under their trucks. Some routes ran dangerously close to German artillery or Luftwaffe strafing attacks. And yet, the convoys never stopped. The Germans, watching from reconnaissance reports, began to realize something deeply unsettling. The Americans weren't collapsing from supply shortages. In fact, their columns were moving faster than ever. Patton's tanks, fueled by this endless stream of Red Ball convoys, began cutting through France with terrifying speed, threatening to trap entire German armies. By early September, as the Allies raced toward the German border, the Red Ball Express had become more than just a supply line. It was a symbol of American determination, ingenuity, and industrial might. But even as it fueled victory, new challenges loomed. The closer they got to Germany, the longer and more dangerous the supply routes became. The trucks were wearing out, and the men were exhausted. Still, the mission continued, because the alternative, failure, was unthinkable. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express was in full swing. From Normandy's dusty depots to the smoking edges of Patton's armored spearheads, the convoy line snaked like a living organism across liberated France. But behind the thundering engines and roaring tires, a dangerous truth was setting in. The Red Ball Express had become both the greatest triumph and the greatest strain on the American war machine. The men behind the wheel, many of them teenagers, others in their early 20s, were operating on pure adrenaline. They slept in 2-hour shifts, ate cold rations on the move, and drove through the night with their headlights covered, guided only by the faint glow of the truck ahead. German snipers, ambushes, and leftover landmines made every trip a gamble. Private First Class Leon Bass, a young African-American driver, later recalled, "You could smell the rubber burning, the oil leaking, and the fear in your own sweat. But we kept driving, because if we stopped, Patton stopped, and if Patton stopped, the whole war stopped." But the problem wasn't just the exhaustion or the danger. It was the sheer scale of what they were trying to do. The Red Ball Express was hauling fuel faster than it could be produced or delivered to the French ports. Every day, the trucks consumed as much gasoline as they delivered. It became an ironic and dangerous equation. The more Patton advanced, the hungrier his army became, and the more the Red Ball Express had to feed that hunger. At one point, Patton's army was using 350,000 gallons of fuel per day, an amount so staggering that even the best logisticians struggled to comprehend it. The Germans, still reeling from the shock of their defeat in Normandy, couldn't believe what they were seeing. One captured German officer reportedly said, "The Americans fight their war with gasoline. We could never imagine an army moving like that." Yet the situation on the ground was far from smooth. The roads of northern France were never meant for such relentless traffic. Mud, wreckage, and craters turned simple routes into treacherous obstacle courses. Trucks broke down by the hundreds each week. Mechanics worked non-stop, scavenging parts from wrecked vehicles to keep others running. Even the weather turned against them. Heavy rains in late September drenched the convoys, reducing visibility and transforming roads into slippery death traps. Accidents skyrocketed. Some drivers skidded off cliffs. Others crashed into each other when brakes failed. In a single week, over 500 trucks were reported damaged beyond repair. But replacements kept coming, proof of America's industrial might. Meanwhile, the men on the front lines began calling the Red Ball Express their lifeline. To the infantry, those convoys meant food, ammo, and survival. To the tankers, those jerry cans of fuel meant one more push toward the German border. But not everyone in the Allied command believed the system could last. By late September, critics inside SHAEF were warning that the Red Ball Express was reaching its breaking point. Some officers claimed the operation was too improvised, too chaotic, too costly. But Eisenhower refused to shut it down. He understood that this was not just a supply line, it was momentum incarnate. And for General George S. Patton, momentum was everything. Patton's Third Army had become a force of nature. His tanks raced across France at speeds that stunned both allies and enemies. His rapid advance helped encircle German forces at the Falaise Pocket, a critical victory that broke the back of the German defense in the west. But Patton was not satisfied. He wanted to push further, into the heart of Germany itself, before winter set in. He needed fuel. Desperate for every drop, Patton famously raged, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." That frustration created intense rivalries within the Allied command. Montgomery IS forces in the north and Patton IS in the south were both demanding priority for limited fuel reserves. The British wanted supplies for Operation Market Garden, the daring airborne assault into the Netherlands. Patton, meanwhile, argued that every gallon sent north was a gallon stolen from victory. In the middle of this logistical tug-of-war, the Red Ball Express became both a savior and a symbol of conflict. The drivers were ordered to push harder, drive faster, and deliver more, no matter the conditions. Mechanics worked by flashlight through the night, welding axles and patching tires with whatever they had. And yet, even amid this chaos, the operation ran with astonishing precision.
Each convoy truck carried a serial number and a designated position in its column. Military police patrolled the routes, ensuring no one strayed. In some areas, convoys were spaced barely a minute apart, a non-stop metal river that stretched from Normandy to the front lines near the German border.
To many soldiers watching from the roadside, it was a sight to behold, a line of endless trucks thundering past, each carrying the power of an empire's industry. But there was another side to this story, one the German generals couldn't see, and one that many Americans didn't fully appreciate at the time. The Red Ball Express was built on the backs of men who had long been underestimated. African-American troops who, in a segregated army, were rarely given recognition for their courage or endurance. Nearly 75% of the drivers were black soldiers. They endured discrimination, harsh conditions, and back-breaking work, yet kept the lifeline open when it mattered most. Private Harold Hayes later recalled, "We weren't heroes in anyone's eyes back then, but we knew what we were doing. We were feeding Patton's army. We were driving victory." Their efforts did not go unnoticed by everyone. General Patton, a man known for his bluntness, once visited a Red Ball depot and reportedly said, "Gentlemen, without you, we wouldn't be here." But just as the Red Ball Express seemed unstoppable, new problems began to emerge. Problems that threatened to derail the entire operation. As the Allies pushed closer to Germany, supply routes stretched dangerously thin. Fuel depots were too far behind, trucks were wearing out faster than they could be repaired, and the enemy, though battered, was beginning to regroup. The question loomed. Could the Red Ball Express keep up with Patton's Blitz before the whole system collapsed under its own weight? By late September 1944, the thunder of Patton's tanks had reached the edges of the Moselle River. His forces had carved a swath across France at lightning speed, an advance so fast that even the most optimistic Allied planners couldn't believe it. But that astonishing pace came at a crushing price. The Red Ball Express, the juggernaut that fueled this momentum, was running dangerously close to collapse. The men at the wheel, those exhausted, grease-streaked drivers, had become ghosts behind the glass. Their shifts never ended. Many were now driving 18 to 20 hours a day, living on coffee, cigarettes, and adrenaline. Accidents were constant. Trucks rolled over in ditches, caught fire, or were abandoned when parts failed. Yet somehow the convoys never stopped. They couldn't stop. Every hour counted. Every mile gained on the Germans was paid for in oil, sweat, and sleepless nights. On September 3, 1944, the Allied spearheads had reached the Meuse River, but the fuel situation had reached a crisis. At one point, Patton's entire Third Army had to halt, not because of German resistance, but because his tanks literally ran dry. His soldiers sat idle in their steel beasts, waiting for the distant rumble of trucks. The Red Ball Express had hit its breaking point. Fuel dumps at Cherbourg and St. Lo were nearly empty, and the ports that could have resupplied them, like Le Havre, were still in ruins from German demolitions. The logistics miracle that had powered Patton's Blitz was now stretched to the limit. The Allied High Command debated the crisis in heated meetings. Montgomery wanted more fuel for his northern offensive, Operation Market Garden, believing his bold push could end the war before Christmas. Patton, meanwhile, was livid. He believed the Germans were on the verge of total collapse, and that every drop of fuel should go to his tanks for one final drive to the Rhine. "I can lick the Germans," Patton famously told his staff, "if someone will give me gas." Behind the front lines, the Red Ball Express headquarters at Chartres was a scene of chaos and determination. Mechanics worked through the night, patching bullet holes and replacing blown tires. Dispatchers pored over maps, rerouting convoys around bombed-out bridges. Drivers staggered in for brief moments of rest, collapsing in mud beside their trucks before heading back out again. Captain William Brooks, one of the logistics officers, later described the sight. It was madness, but it was organized madness. You'd see 1,000 trucks in line, engines roaring, lights covered, rolling through the night. It was like watching an army of ants carrying the war on their backs. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. As the convoys thundered forward, the Germans began to take notice. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights spotted the endless lines of trucks streaming eastward. German intelligence officers were stunned. They had never seen anything like it. To the Germans, logistics was an afterthought, an appendage to battle. To the Americans, logistics was the battle. One German general later admitted, "We had not imagined that the Americans could move entire armies so far, so fast. They fought a new kind of war, a war of wheels." But while the Germans marveled, they also struck back. Small Luftwaffe raids targeted the Red Ball routes. Snipers and saboteurs attacked isolated convoys, setting fuel trucks ablaze and cutting communication lines. French resistance groups, now operating openly, fought to protect the convoys, ambushing German remnants, hiding in forests and towns. Every mile of road became a contested battleground, not with tanks, but with grit and fuel. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express was carrying an average of 12,000 tons of supplies every day, a staggering figure that dwarfed anything seen before. To put that into perspective, the operation was moving more tonnage daily than the entire German rail network could deliver to the Western Front. But the price of that achievement was enormous. Trucks and tires were wearing out faster than replacements could arrive. 1/3 of all Red Ball vehicles were sidelined at any given time due to breakdowns. Mechanics scoured junkyards and cannibalized wrecked vehicles for usable parts. Even with these efforts, shortages persisted. And then came the weather. Autumn rains swept across France, turning dirt roads into rivers of mud. Drivers struggled to keep their trucks from sliding off narrow embankments. Many failed. Convoys became snarled in endless traffic jams, steel beasts stuck in knee-deep sludge, engines overheating, tempers flaring. Sergeant James Bolden, an African-American driver, remembered it vividly. We'd be knee-deep in mud, trying to push a truck twice our size with Germans still shooting at us from somewhere in the woods. You didn't think about medals or glory, you just thought about getting that gas where it needed to go. As October began, Eisenhower and his commanders realized something had to change. The Red Ball Express couldn't sustain its insane tempo forever. The Allied advance had slowed, and winter was coming. Supply lines needed to be reorganized. New depots were built closer to the front, railroads repaired, and ports finally reopened. And so, on November 16, 1944, after 82 grueling days and over 400,000 tons of supplies delivered, the Red Ball Express officially ended. But its impact was far from over. It had proven something that the world had never seen before, a nation's ability to turn industry into raw, unstoppable motion. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply line. It was the lifeblood of an army that refused to stop. Even German commanders admitted it. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt later remarked, "The Allies could replace their material losses faster than we could destroy them. We could not fight against a nation that moved on gasoline and trucks." Yet, beneath all the statistics and tonnage, there remained a deeper story, a human one. The story of thousands of drivers, most of them unsung, who risked their lives without the promise of glory, who faced danger not with rifles, but with steering wheels and courage. The men of the Red Ball Express had become the backbone of Allied victory. But as winter approached and the front slowed, another challenge loomed, one that would test every ounce of endurance they had left. Because while the Red Ball Express had carried the Allies to the gates of Germany, it would soon have to help them survive the bloodiest winter of the war. As November 1944 gave way to December, the Red Ball Express had officially shut down. Its trucks were reassigned, its routes reopened to normal traffic, and its drivers scattered among other supply units. The Allies believed the logistical miracle that powered the summer Blitz was no longer needed. They were wrong. Because within weeks, the German army would launch one of the most ferocious counterattacks of the entire war, the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Hitler unleashed his final gamble, Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. His goal was audacious: punch through the Allied lines, split their forces, and capture the port of Antwerp. If successful, the war in the West could be prolonged by months, maybe even turned in Germany's favor. Caught off guard, Allied units were thrown into chaos. The weather grounded aircraft, roads were choked with snow, and fuel once again became the difference between victory and annihilation. And so, like a ghost returning from the past, the spirit of the Red Ball Express rose once more. The drivers who had spent the summer racing through the dust of France were called back into action, this time into ice and death. The same trucks, patched together with salvaged parts, now roared across Belgium's frozen roads, carrying food, ammunition, and fuel to the surrounded troops of the 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne. The men joked grimly that it wasn't the Red Ball anymore. It was the White Ball Express. Imagine it. Temperatures plunging below freezing, snow blinding the road, and artillery flashes lighting the night sky. Drivers wrapped themselves in blankets and rags to stay alive. Many trucks didn't have heaters. Some men froze at the wheel. Yet the convoys rolled on. Corporal Luther Johnson later recalled, "We drove through snow so deep it came up to the running boards. We couldn't see 10 feet ahead, but we kept going. If Bastogne fell, the whole line would crack. We couldn't let that happen." The Germans called the Americans the Army of Trucks. And for good reason. Even in the heart of winter, when the Wehrmacht's tanks ran dry, Allied convoys kept moving. When Patton swung his Third Army north to relieve Bastogne in December 1944, his tanks needed tens of thousands of gallons of fuel, delivered over frozen, bombed-out roads. It was the same story as before. Every mile gained, every counterattack launched, rested on the shoulders of the supply drivers. And they delivered. By Christmas, the convoys had broken through. Patton's army smashed into the besieged town, and the 101st held firm. Bastogne was saved. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last great gasp of the German war machine. Their gamble failed, their fuel ran out, and their army began its final retreat toward the Rhine. But behind that victory lay a truth few would recognize at the time. The war had been won as much by logistics as by bullets. The Red Ball Express, born in desperation during the summer of '44, had proven the unthinkable. That America could move an army across a continent faster than its enemies could comprehend. Even German officers admitted it after the war. General Alfred Jodl, who served as one of Hitler's senior planners, confessed during his Nuremberg interrogation, "The Americans' ability to move material is what defeated us. We were not beaten tactically. We were exhausted logistically." And he was right. When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the long columns of supply trucks followed close behind, no longer under the Red Ball name, but carrying the same spirit. By then, the men who had driven those trucks, the soldiers of the Red Ball Express, had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies in just 82 days at unimaginable cost. They'd built the foundation for victory in Western Europe. When victory came that May, many of them were quietly reassigned, their service records filed away without fanfare. There were no parades for the drivers who had kept the tanks moving, no medals for the mechanics who had kept the convoys alive. But history remembers them now. Because without those men, many of them young, black, and overlooked, Patton's Blitz across France might have sputtered to a halt in the dust of Normandy. They didn't just drive trucks. They drove the war forward. They drove victory. And when the last convoy rolled to a stop in early 1945, and the engines finally went quiet, the world had changed. America's logistical triumph had rewritten the rules of warfare, proving that no army could fight faster, further, or fiercer than the one whose lifeline never broke. In the words of a U.S. Army logistics officer after the war, the Red Ball Express didn't just deliver supplies, it delivered freedom. When the dust finally settled over Europe in 1945, the guns fell silent, but the echoes of the Red Ball Express roared on. What began as an improvised solution to a desperate problem became one of the most legendary feats of logistics in military history. Even German generals who had once mocked American supply lines later studied the Red Ball system with awe and respect. General Heinz Guderian himself was reported to have remarked that the Allies' ability to maintain such momentum was a weapon in itself. By the time the Red Ball Express was shut down in November 1944, it had transported over 412,000 tons of supplies, a staggering figure that kept Patton's tanks fueled, the infantry fed, and the Western Front advancing. More than 6,000 trucks thundered down the dusty roads each day, and over 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers, many from segregated units who were never fully recognized during the war. Their courage and endurance under constant danger became one of the unsung stories of Allied victory. One veteran, Private William McNeil, later said, "We were the army behind the army. Without us, Patton's tanks would have stopped cold. We didn't carry rifles, but we carried the war on our backs." Despite its success, the Red Ball Express was not glamorous. Drivers slept in their trucks, battled exhaustion, and often repaired vehicles on the roadside under the threat of Luftwaffe strafing runs. Yet through mud, rain, and chaos, they delivered, mile after mile, night after night. And while historians often highlight the brilliance of Patton or Eisenhower, few remember that none of their victories could have happened without the relentless rhythm of those roaring engines. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the supply routes across France became ghost roads. The Red Ball signs were taken down, the convoys stopped, and the drivers returned home, many quietly, with no parades or recognition. But decades later, their contribution was finally acknowledged. In 1992, surviving veterans were honored in ceremonies recognizing their essential role in the liberation of Europe. Even the U.S. Army's modern logistics system still studies the Red Ball Express as a model for speed, improvisation, and resilience under pressure. It wasn't just a convoy, it was a symbol of American ingenuity, the ability to turn chaos into coordination, to transform dirt roads into lifelines, and to make the impossible seem routine. And perhaps the greatest irony of all? Those same German officers who once sneered at America's soft army and clumsy supply corps later admitted defeat not only on the battlefield, but in the war of logistics. The Red Ball Express proved that wars aren't only won by tanks and bombers, but by the men who keep them moving. As General Dwight D. Eisenhower later said, "You will not find it difficult to prove that battles, campaigns, and even wars have been won or lost primarily because of logistics." The Red Ball Express didn't just move fuel, it moved history. It showed that victory isn't only forged in the heat of combat, but also in the long, sleepless nights of those who make the war machine run. Their legacy reminds us that even the most powerful generals depend on the quiet heroes in the shadows, the drivers, mechanics, and loaders who never stopped rolling. So the next time you see an image of Patton's tanks roaring through France, remember, behind every tank there was a truck, and behind every truck there was a soldier, tired, determined, and unstoppable. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most incredible untold stories, make sure to subscribe for more historical documentaries just like this one. Leave a comment below. What do you think was the most impressive logistical feat of the war? Thank you for watching. And remember, the Red Ball Express didn't just deliver supplies, it delivered victory.